the main reason why was really interested to speak with you is because kind of like similar to these guys, I think a lot of the influencers you hear about when you get inside of the community. The way I found carnivore community was just listening to like Zach Bitter on Joe Rogan, who I don't even think is a carnivore. But ironically, I was listening to a podcast with you, him, and Sean Baker from 2018. It was kind of fun to listen
Oh,
back
nice.
on. But no, the reason I was really interested to speak with you is because of kind of your rhetoric just on salt and understanding that, and like me without a colon, like I've always known that something like carnivore works for people in my position or similar positions, but I was always kind of stumped on like certain questions. Like I need to do this diet to a very high degree to experience like optimal success that other people would experience. And so when I came to like this whole salt free rhetoric, and then I started to like read more into your work, I was kind of like, it was a little surprising because it was like we're saying almost the same exact things, but I was like, I've never crossed paths with you before, but we're saying very similar things. So there's got to be something here. So that's like the main reason why I'm excited to speak with you today.
That's really fun. Yeah, I'm glad that you came across that, and I'm glad that you contacted me.
Yep. Um, but yeah, I guess I'll just get it started off. I'll do like an introduction but after this as well and edit it in. But as far as I understand, you've been in this diet since 2008, 2009, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I was doing low carb since 97 actually, and then I switched to a plant-free diet in 2009. And I've done a little bit of experimentation outside of the carnivore boundaries in the last couple of years, but basically I'm back to it because it's really the best thing for me.
And so I guess just to take it way back, what was your interpretation of like a low carb, like in the 90s? That's way
Uh,
ahead.
well, I had been I had heard of it in probably around 1992 or 93, and thought it was the craziest, most ridiculous sounding thing I'd ever heard, because it went against everything that I thought I knew to be true in terms of, carbohydrates are supposed to be the foundation of the diet. But um, then I was struggling with weight issues myself. And after I gave veganism a good try for maybe 6 months or something like that, um, I had traveled. Um, I was studying Russian, and I went to stay in Russia for a semester. And I decided to eat some meat rather than make it really difficult for myself. Um, and I did it. I actually came home weighing less than I was before. And although I didn't necessarily think that the having added meat caused me to lose the weight, I realized that being vegan wasn't necessarily necessary for losing weight. And that's when it was that year that Mike Eads and Mary Dan Eads published Protein Power. So that was in the bookstores, and I picked it up, and it just completely changed my life because I hadn't really come across a well-reasoned book or treatise, explaining why this could be a good thing. And I completely immersed myself at that point.
Gotcha. And correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard you mention it sounds like one of the main reasons why you started getting into diets like this was for like bipolar syndrome, or was there other things as well that was inspiring this?
No, not at all. The bipolar remission that I experienced was completely unexpected. I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder when I was 20. So that was like 93.
Hmm.
And I was on antidepressants for a long time. And then I was re-diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 2 when I was in my 30s. And type 2 means that you don't have psychotic mania breaks, but you do have the depression side. And you have what are called hypomanias, which are in people with bipolar type 1, that would be the beginning of a manic phase. But then in type 2, it kind of stops and corrects before it gets to that. And it turns out this can be actually induced by antidepressant medication. And so I'm pretty sure that that was the ultimate cause of why it went that far. But I was suffering from that when I started a carnivore diet, which I started only because even though I was on a low carb diet for a dozen years at that point, I had initially lost weight and maintained it for a little while, but then I had regained, and it might have been partly because of the antidepressants, it might have been aging or pregnancies, I really don't know. But I was definitely not successful and looking for something else. And so I saw all these people who were doing a low carb diet in this particularly extreme way. And I thought, well, I could try that and for a little while, and maybe it would help me the way it's helping these people. I had no expectation that it would do anything more than cause me to hopefully lose weight again. But the mood piece was what made me really think there's something extraordinary going on here.
So you felt a massive
Absolutely.
uplift in your own mood.
I had an uplift, but it was also a more stable uplift. Like it didn't feel like a crazy,
Yeah.
out of control kind of uplift. And of course, when I planned to try it, I only planned to try it for a few weeks because I really was thinking of it as like a weight loss, quick weight loss thing. And bipolar has this like long time trajectory. At the time, I was in such a bad state that I was actually experiencing fast, rapid cycling, they call it, where within one day you can have multiple moods. And that straightened out right away. But because it has this long time scale, I didn't really understand the full implications of it until it had been a long time. I mean, at least before I could trust that that was really an effect that was happening.
Yeah,
And the
exactly.
veganism wasn't solving this.
No.
The
Just one
veganism
of the
didn't really
questions.
do much for me.
I've just got a question around medication for bipolar. Is it the same sort of class of medication as medication for schizophrenia? Because we had someone on last week that was schizophrenic, and she eats huge amounts of fat rather than in ratio to protein as to what a normal carnivore diet is, and she has her schizophrenia under control completely at the moment.
The meds, there are different kinds. So the antidepressants, before I was re-diagnosed, they have a few different classes, but the classes of drugs for bipolar are a little bit different. And a lot of them are actually anticonvulsants for epilepsy, which should be a big clue right there, right? The same kind of treatment that treats epilepsy treats bipolar. I don't know why that didn't ring a lot of bells with people until more recently, but they are also, I also did some that were more antipsychotic. I tried maybe 6 different kinds, and none of them really helped me, and they all had horrible side effects. And among those, I think were a couple anticonvulsants, an antipsychotic, and an anti-anxiety drug. The one that was an antipsychotic, maybe the name will come to me in a moment, but it's not right now. But it made me feel like a zombie. Like I basically just slept all day and couldn't think. And so it was intolerable. I had to get off it quickly.
I mean, I can't even imagine. I was prescribed to Adderall medication, so I can't even imagine with an antipsychotic because I felt like a zombie on Adderall medication, you know? But that's yeah. Go ahead, James. You got something to say?
Yeah,
Seroquel. It was Seroquel.
Seroquel. Yeah, just one last one, Goody, if that's all right, and then we can get back to what we're supposed to be doing. Do you think
Absolutely.
that your sort of mood and how you were feeling when you were taking that medication was anything to do with the sort of build-up of insulin resistance that can happen with those kinds of medications? Were you testing glucose levels or anything at the time?
I wasn't, and I really had no thought that there could be a dietary component. I believed it was some kind of genetic potential or, some chemical imbalance or some nonsense like that. And it didn't really even cross my mind that it could be diet related.
So did you get into the diet to kind of lose weight and then you started to see cognitive benefits as well? and then you
Yes.
started to go like pretty much balls deep with it, and then like come 2008, 2009, you're like, fuck it, I'm going carnivore.
Well, I didn't necessarily have cognitive benefits that I was aware of early on, except I did notice that I felt better and that it included feel like a better outlook and mood when I was more compliant with a low carb diet. But it wasn't so extreme that I thought that it was a direct effect. I think I thought it was, I'm getting my goals met, I'm feeling good in my body, and so I'm in a better mood. And I didn't really make the stronger biological connection of the brain being part of the body that is so
Mm.
obvious in retrospect. But because
Yes, it
people
is.
didn't talk about it that way then, it just, I thought of it as something completely separate.
Gotcha.
Yeah, as we did.
It's all
As
I
all
guess.
of it did.
So what was the big thing that got you into the carnivore diet? Was it this book that you read on meat and protein, or was there just curiosity, or what really drove that?
No, so the protein power book from Mike Eads is really just a low carb diet. But I think he named it Protein Power either by himself or at the encouragement of his publishers, because protein is a lot more acceptable of a thing to talk about than fat. And so it was more like this is a high protein diet kind of thing rather than what it really is, which is a high fat diet. So that book is really all about low carb. They do have sections about making sure you get adequate protein, and definitely the book talks about that as something that's important. But it wasn't really meat centric. It was just a low carb diet with fairly agnostic as to where you would get all of your macronutrients from. It wasn't until so I started reading a lot online, and I had been doing that for a while, especially in the low carb and keto community, where because there wasn't a lot of discussion in mainstream, there were a lot of corners of the internet where people were talking about it. So there were some um, forums. This was before Facebook, so
Was Reddit maybe?
Reddit came along, but I didn't join Reddit until 2014.
Wow,
Um,
gotcha. Still pretty early.
yeah, and I joined it because that was started by Aaron Schwartz, and he had died, and I wanted to give some late kind of support. I don't know.
Yeah, shit. I guess that's kind of interesting too, not to go off on another tangent, but you're like an ambassador for Zcash, aren't you?
I am, yeah. I'm on the community grants committee for Zcash, and been doing that for a couple of years.
So that's where that was another trip in the matrix for me, and just like finding a parallel between each other, because I don't invest in Zcash, but I literally only invest in one cryptocurrency, and it's Monero. So it's kind of similar
Oh,
to
yeah.
Zcash, but I thought
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. So, but anyway, it's about a decade into the 2000s era. What did the carnivore diet kind of look like? Because I know you've kind of mentioned how it's kind of changed over time. So maybe if you could just discuss like what it looked like when you first joined versus how it kind of looks right now.
Yeah, it's very, very different. And in some ways, I think there's been wisdom that's been lost, and it's really a shame. When I started, I was looking as I mentioned, I had gained weight. I believed very strongly in the scientific literature that I'd read about low carb diets and ketogenic diets. I'd been studying it very intensely since the late 90s. And so I knew that those things seemed to be scientifically supported, but I didn't understand why everything that I was doing, which I thought was what I should be doing, wasn't getting me where I wanted to be. And so there was that disconnect. And so I was constantly, I was kind of driving myself crazy, to be honest. I was constantly looking for some kind of outside answer, like it just, the topic of the week. Like, is it because I had the MTHFR gene? Is it because I wasn't getting enough choline, or, like my vitamin D level wasn't right? I was just looking for some piece of the puzzle that I felt like once I found it, everything else should start working the way it was supposed to be working. And so it was through that search, I guess, that I finally stumbled across this forum. And again, everything was usually in these separate forums. And so I found this forum called Zeroing In on Health, which was run by Charles Washington. And as the name kind of indicates, he and some of the inner circle people there had already kind of figured out that what they were doing was improving their health. It wasn't really just about weight loss, but they were calling what they were doing zero carb, because I guess that's how they came to it. They were just kind of figuring out ways to get less and less carbohydrate, because for a lot of us, it seemed like, well, there's this different amount of carbs that different people tolerate in order to really get into their groove. And some people can tolerate 30 grams and some people can only tolerate 15. And maybe we're a group of people who need to take it down to zero. And I think that's basically what everyone coming into it at that time thought it was mostly about, is just getting the carbohydrates down to the level that you need to get them down to make this work for you. But in addition to that, the people who were on that forum, they were calling it zero carb, but they had gone beyond. It wasn't really about carbohydrates, because they weren't eating vegetable oils or things that were, net carb zero. It was really all about eating from the animal kingdom. And the heroes that they were looking up to and the readings that we were doing were all from Stephenson and from the bear, who were eating these all animal diets, in the one case based on Inuit and the other based on, well, I don't know where the bear drew his initial inspiration, but
Maybe Stephenson.
Yeah, I'm sure. So we were following them closely as to figuring out how to compose what our diet was, because we didn't really have anyone else to look up to, and we had only a couple of examples of success. And so the most sensible thing to do is to look at the people who have succeeded and try to copy them, and then do our own experimentation around that as a base. And so, both the bear and Stephenson were not pushers of eating organ meats, none of this nose to tail stuff. And neither of them were pushing salt the way that it is today. So those were major differences. And there also was, at that time, because a lot of the people who ended up in our group were people who had had trouble with weight loss, we were, it wasn't like today, a lot of people come to it through bodybuilding and they're already in, better shape than I'll ever be in my life. And they're just trying to find something even better. And that draws a different type of person with a different type of metabolic flexibility and a different type of needs than people who are coming at it from, I've really got to get my metabolic shape in, health and shape.
Totally.
And so what a lot of people where they were coming from was this huge focus on getting high ketosis and reducing their calories, and to their detriment in a lot of cases. So a lot of people would have a long history of caloric restriction. And so partly because of that, a lot of the focus in those groups was about stop counting things, stop trying to get in ketosis. I mean, we didn't have the measuring devices that we have now either. We only had urine strips, and those aren't going to be reliable after you've passed keto adaptation necessarily. Yeah. But a lot of people were still trying to not eat enough. So we were always very adamant that on the carnivore diet, you should not try to track your macros. You should not try to track your calories. You should eat until you're really full every day, and not try to fast. If you feel like not eating, that's fine, go with it, but not do all these deliberate things to try to lose weight, and to really reteach your body that once you're getting the nutrients you need, your health will come online. And once your health comes online, then the excess fat will start to naturally go away. So that was really the zeitgeist that we had. And obviously that's very, very different from the way that it gets marketed today.
Right.
Yeah, it seems
Uh,
there are kind of
but
maybe two or three schools of thought at least these days, and I agree. It's interesting looking at some of the some very very fit people and who are also very young, who have never been metabolically ill or had any issues. They know very well. They have all the answers, and the rest of us are just a bunch of fools. But anyway, yeah, Amber, I wanted to ask you what do you think is the biggest um, misconception people have about the carnivore diet now that we're at it?
Hmm. That's a great question. And the thing that popped in my mind, I might get a different answer if you ask me tomorrow, but the thing that popped into my mind is that it's about ingredients. Um, I started to see the first hints of this in about 2017 when someone offered me to cook something. And I had told them that I only eat meat, and they were going to make me something that was like a kind of noodle dish that was based on all carnivore, like all animal ingredients. And I had this sinking feeling in my gut. And I'm like, yeah, probably I could eat that and it wouldn't have the same reaction that I might have to eating plants. But this is not the carnivore diet.
like
And
lasagna.
y- yeah, and I do think like so back in the low carb keto days, you could see this progression where, you know, I mean, even if you go back to the 1800s, there was Banting, and he had a pamphlet about doing a low carb diet for weight loss. And if you look at it and you look at would have been available at that time, no one was buying like keto bars and all these special products that have artificial sugars and things like that. You had to go back to this specific set of foods that were available at the time that would fit being low carb, and it was basically like meat and eggs and some low starch vegetables, and that is basically it. But when after the low carb diets had many waves of popularity where it's like become popular and then receded again, and even in my lifetime at least 3 times, I think. But I could see there was like a wave of it in the 90s, and it came with like it was a marketing opportunity, and it came with all these things that people started buying and using to uh, to go with their diet, and recipes to try to make things that looked like their old favorite comfort foods.
Mm.
And I'm of two minds about it, because I think if you're struggling and you've got a craving for something, you can't get it off your mind, or if there's some event that's coming up and it really, calls for something special, and you make something that fits in especially in a low carb diet where you can count the carbs, um, and it fits, and it that's the difference between you going off your diet and not, then I think that can be a really powerful, helpful tool. But on the other hand, if your diet becomes based on all of these, we used to call them frankenfoods, all of these like recipe-based things, um, I think what you see is it's almost a Goodhart's law kind of thing, where you've got this target that you're going for, and then the target becomes the goal, but the target wasn't what you really cared about in the first place, and then it creates this separation between the actual goal. And I think we started to see more and more people failing on a low carb diet that seemed to be directly correlated with the foods that they were eating, even though they were low carb. And so I immediately thought, oh my goodness, the same thing is going to happen with carnivore. People are going to start making all these carnivore things that are not what a carnivore diet is based on, and we're going to see not the same results. And I think that actually has pretty much come to fruition at this point. And I think that comes from basing the diet on ingredients rather than food.
Seems like there's a
That's
line
just
as well between like ketogenic diets with carnivore diets. Like when I got into this in 2018, 2019, I thought I was carnivore, and I remember being on Reddit and constantly, nah, that's keto, that's keto, that's keto. And and now it's like 2024, and you go on the carnivore community, it's exactly like you say, like there's carnivore pizza, there's carnivore cookies, carnivore bread. It kind of questions the purpose of it.
Yeah.
So,
And again, I think those kinds of things, if you need to be on a plant-free diet and you would like to have something that's more like what other people are having, you want something fun and it's once in a while, I think that's probably fine. And some people tolerate it better than others. But
Yeah.
it's just when it becomes the main composition of your diet, that's where things start to go wrong.
so maybe this is a little bit of an inferential leap, but I kind of draw the conclusion that a lot of like this modern, I don't know, I call it like an easier barrier to entry is because of almost, it seems like the standard we put forth of how to do a carnivore diet doesn't necessarily strike me as what's the word, like it just seems hard and repeatable. So like I see a lot of yo-yoing constantly, and so I guess to make a little bit of an inferential leap, like did you start to notice any sort of correlation with things like salt consumption on a carnivore diet that was leading to things like this, or is that totally unrelated?
So for a long time with salt in particular, I thought there wasn't really any difference. I thought, it's bizarre that people are now saying the carnivore diet is composed of meat, water, and salt, whereas we used to say it's meat and water. um, but and I wanted to make sure that people knew that salt was not a necessary component, which I think that in a lot of spaces people act like it is. But I didn't notice that people were actually, or I didn't think that I noticed that people were having problems until just a couple of years ago, when I gave a talk in 2022 about salt, about this conundrum. And a lot of people in certain Facebook groups and in other places started experimenting with lowering or eliminating salt and reporting really good results, like saying, oh, I had no idea all this time I've had this one or two problems that were still not going away. And as soon as I stopped eating the salt, that was the missing piece. And then on the contrary, or not on the contrary, but in another realm, it occurred to me that digestive issues can sometimes be caused by taking too much salt. And so at this point, I've also heard a couple anecdotes about people realizing that when they dropped salt on carnivore, they weren't getting diarrhea. And this may be, it'd have to be a little bit tested. But what I suspect is that once the carnivore diet started being equated with meat, water, and salt, and people started really eating a lot of salt when they started a carnivore diet to try it, that's when this whole carnivore diet causes diarrhea thing started. Because that was something we really didn't see that back on ZIOH. I wouldn't say we never saw it. I think that would happen occasionally, but it wasn't like, oh, everyone knows that when you start a carnivore diet, you're going to have diarrhea first. Like that to me is like, what? That's not true. Where are you getting this? And so my suspicion right now is that this is actually a consequence of salt being promoted as part of the diet.
Yeah, I mean, I just as a testimony, like I said earlier, like I have to do very extreme forms to get just normal results on a carnivore diet. And I was doing beef, salt, and water, like the Jordan Peterson diet, Lion diet, or whatever. And I was still having, like, I would get up in the middle of the night. I would have to go pass a stool or something because I don't have a colon, large intestine, and it would be like liquid, scentless stool. And for the longest time, I was just I could not put my finger on it. And then one day I actually went to the emergency room because I was drinking too much salt and I like got dehydrated. And I started to put two and two together that, holy cow, maybe there's something with salt and looser stools and this and that. And so I just cut out the salt, kept the same diet, and exactly like you say, like saw almost like within days, like complete results. So just a little testimony to that. You gave a speech in 2022. That wasn't the blood, sweat, and tears speech though, was it?
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it was. Okay. Gotcha. So you had started to examine with that. What about like currently? Like, where would you put yourself on that standard? Like, do you still use it, just not as much? Are you completely off of it? Or like,
Salt?
yeah,
Yeah, so when I started the carnivore diet in 2009, my impression, because of the, the influences of the Bear and Stephenson, was that we didn't eat salt on a carnivore diet. And so I gave it up, and I gave up all spices. I kept coffee, but I ate a diet of mostly beef and morning coffee, and that was it, no salt. And I've never really looked back. Um, I will have it every once in a while. I eat bacon from time to time, but I actually don't really like it, which is heresy, I know. But uh, it it's because it's so
crazy
salty.
actually.
It's because it's so salty, like, and especially if the crisper it's cooked, the saltier it tastes. And so if I eat bacon, I like it very lightly cooked, but I much, much, much prefer just pork belly by itself. Um, every once in a while, I will think I'll think, geez, it would be nice to have salt on this, and I'll put a little bit of salt. But actually, if I put too much salt, it makes me feel nauseated. And I think the only time that I really will consistently have salt is if I have a broth. And then it's with water. And I think that's just because water needs electrolytes to balance.
So what about, I mean, would you ever just make a broth without salt?
Um, so if I do make broth, it's just like I've put some tough cut of meat or some bones into water and boiled it, and then I'll drink the water off it. And sometimes I feel like that needs salt, and sometimes I don't. But
I
yeah,
gotcha.
but I don't salt my meals, and I never have since I started carnivore.
Gotcha. Me and Klaus, we've kind of talked about this a little bit in terms of a ketogenic diet. Like, do you think that there is an advantage for people that are consuming low proteins to consume something like salt? Or, what's kind of your stance on that? Would it be better to do something like dried meat and eating jerky? Or, like, is there advantages to salt in certain situations from your perspective?
Well, I don't salt my jerky either.
Me
Um,
either. I don't either.
but in the keto condition, when you're talking about a diet where it's including plants, I think that there may be more of a need for salt to balance out the high potassium in the plants. And I also think that on keto diets, people tend to drink a lot more fluids, not because they need to, but because of either it's they're drinking sugar-free soda type things, that they're drinking more for the familiarity of the taste and the flavor, and that makes them drink more than they would if they were just drinking to thirst, which might require more sodium to balance. But if you're just talking about the difference between a straight up carnivore diet, which tends to be maybe 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio, um, to a more ketogenic style of carnivore diet where you're eating only animal foods, but you've really restricted your protein to minimum, and then you're eating all the rest of your calories as fat, whether that needs a little more salt. Um, I'm not sure, but I do know that sometimes I and other people I've talked to have experienced when they do that, you go through a sort of second keto adaptation almost, and you can get symptoms that might feel better if you add salt too. I do think that during the keto adaptation period in particular, I don't think that salt is actually needed because of a study that I went through in that talk showing that if you try to chase salt during fasting to chase the excretion, because there is some salt excretion, you'll just excrete all that much more. And the reason seems to be that the ketogenic metabolism is a state that has lower extracellular fluid, and you just don't need as much fluid, and therefore you don't need as much salt. And so this excretion is actually trying to get you to a different fluid and isotonic balance than you would be on a high carb diet.
That makes sense.
But nonetheless, even though I don't think that keto adaptation really requires salt for that reason, I do know that observationally, people who have struggles with the keto adaptation, like flu-like symptoms, sometimes get improvement to have salt during that period. And so you can't argue with observations. And so if that's helping at that time, I think that's okay. Whether it would be beneficial or to what degree ongoing in a much more ketogenic state, I'm not sure.
What do you think? There seems to be a lot of, I don't know if it's myth or wishful thinking, whatever it is, around people getting a lot of cramping, and then they think, okay, I need to increase my salt. That maybe it's something else. And the reason I'm asking is because I just recently I did 16 days with adding 0 salt to anything, and it didn't really change. I don't use a lot of salt from as a baseline, but it made no change, except I had absolutely 0 cramps for 16 days. Sometimes I have a little bit of cramping, but absolutely nothing when I didn't add any salt.
Well, you said
Yeah.
the other thing too you should mention as well.
Yeah. At the end of it, what made you add salt back, Klaus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting
sorry, yeah.
as well.
I added salt back, and we're talking about a pinch of salt on my, just a small pinch. And I think maybe it might be psychosomatic. I don't know, but I was getting really some serious anxiety, kind of at day 15 and day 16, and I didn't at first. I didn't notice it. I didn't connect it, and maybe I connected it wrong. It might have been something else, but to me, nothing in my external or internal environment changed other than the salting. So I added the salt back, and in the evening, and the next morning, I just felt back to normal. So I don't know whether it was the salt or not. And we were just talking about a pinch. So who knows?
Yeah, all of that's really interesting about the cramps. But one thing that I have noticed talking to carnivore dieters in particular who have dropped salt is that very often it does resolve the cramps only if they also stop taking other electrolytes that they may have been supplementing with. And what I think is that sometimes they're getting themselves into a vicious circle by so they're taking magnesium and potassium, and then they need the sodium to prevent the cramps from getting that electrolyte imbalance. And only when they rest it all, stop taking any of it and stop messing with it, that seems to come back to balance. And so I've heard similar stories from you where even though sodium in certain cases can prevent cramps, it also seems to be causing them in other cases. And it's really, you can really get messed up by trying to chase all these nutrient cycles. It's very popular in a lot of health circles, in keto and keto adjacent circles, especially I think with the repeat people, in terms of trying to find all these supplements and missing nutrients. And then, for each, it's kind of like with medications. For each one that you take, it causes an imbalance in another. So you take this other one, and you take this other one, and it just never ends.
So do we need
to
to supplement, do you think?
Do we need which?
Do we need to supplement?
Well, I think there can be individual cases where you've got some pre-existing deficiency, and eating a carnivore diet just as is never going to right that deficiency until you address it and get yourself back up to repletion. I think there are cases like that. I would like to think that in most cases, once you're at a good baseline level, you don't have to add anything back. But there's always going to be cases where someone's got some specific condition that's maybe you've got lipedema and that's causing you to need more folate or something. All of these kinds of problems can put more of a drain than you would normally have. But I think that starting with no supplements is actually a really good baseline. And we often have this idea that vitamins are just, they have only upside. And so people think, well, my diet is dialed in but there are some places where I'm not sure I'm getting enough of this or that. So I'm going to take this supplement as like an insurance factor, just to make sure that I'm getting everything that I need. And it never crosses their mind that that could also be creating an imbalance and that they would be better off without it. And so I think having a default of no supplements, or at least to try no supplements now and again, can be better than having them in a lot of cases.
Yeah, excellent
Just on
points.
that too.
Thank you for making that clear. I think this is going to be a very very interesting point for the people who are watching this.
Yeah, with the supplement part as well. From my bro scientist, as I call it, research, it seems like a lot of vitamins are not heat tolerant. And like, I mean, when you think about us, like we've been cooking cooking meat for a lot of time. Like if someone was to consider something like supplementing, would it be wiser to focus on minerals and microminerals than things like vitamins?
Maybe so. I mean, minerals I think are withstand heat well, but what they don't withstand is dripping. So, if especially I think most people don't eat a lot of boiled meat, but there's an older experiment from Finney and maybe Volek, in which they had ketogenic athletes, probably athletes, they're all studying athletes. But the important point was they were giving them boiled chicken and
Boil in fat, not water.
no, in water. And if you don't give them the water that comes off, they become potassium deficient.
Oh, that's weird.
So if you're doing a lot of cooking methods where you might be losing things in the runoff, it would be wise to collect that, or you may need to make up for it. And the other thing you mentioned about heat and vitamins being heat sensitive, that's definitely true. So for example, vitamin C is heat sensitive. Taurine is heat sensitive.
There's a few fat soluble ones too, I should say too.
Yeah. And so one thing that we took note of or noticed collectively back in ZIOH days was that a lot of people who started a carnivore diet, especially if they didn't come from a very meat-heavy diet before, like me, I grew up in basically a vegetarian household, and I had meat at my grandparents and stuff. I wasn't disallowed it, but it wasn't really part of my home culture.
Did you grow up in Boulder? Sorry.
No, I grew up in Nova Scotia, but that would be a very Boulder thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would.
Even though we're here, we're surrounded by, cattle farms. But when people would start a carnivore diet, especially if they have no salt, and the only way you can get a flavor profile is from the meat, people start to actually desire to cook their meat less and less. Maybe only goes to a point, like maybe medium rare and no rarer. But if you're eating your meat to medium, I think that's a way better vitamin profile than if you're eating it to well done. Just for these subtle things that add up a lot when meat is your only source of food.
With the water simmering thing, are you saying that it doesn't necessarily get destroyed, but it transfers from the meat into the water?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. I learned something today.
I've learned a few
things.
You've got to do what I do. You have to eat your meat raw. Goody. That's the way.
Yeah, you're freaking. Or as another one of our guys likes to let his meat, he waits until it gets rotten, and then it has what is he fucking bugs and shit on it. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, that I wouldn't go that far.
But, so you go ahead.
Well, I think fermentation was the way to preserve things before salt came along, and we really have a long history of it. And I think that allowing, we had to, unlike a lot of other meat-eating animals or meat-eating primates, we were dealing with these large carcasses, which we had no other way to preserve except through fermentation. I think that the pH of our stomach, for example, is a testament to our being able to withstand a lot more bacterial and fermented foods than what other animals might have. And in addition to that, because of our strange way of becoming carnivores through this much this really herbivorous pathway through great apes, we used to have this whole foregut fermentation process that's really drastically reduced in humans compared to other great apes. And the idea of fermenting something outside of the colon is actually maybe a huge technology that helped us become who we are. So even though the idea of fermenting meat from a cultural perspective to me growing up in Canada is pretty foreign and seems kind of like almost disgusting. I certainly have no objection to fermented dairy or no objection to fermented plants, and there are a lot of cultures that ferment meat without that kind of aversion. But the only thing is, because it's not a cultural heritage, you can't just go buy fermented meat in the stores the way you can buy fermented dairy or sauerkraut or something like that. And so if you wanted to do it, you basically have to do it yourself. And then it gets scary because how do I know that I've cultivated the right bacteria?
Yeah, how do you know?
Yeah,
it's safe?
absolutely. I would question my only counter to that is just quite like, if you have an abundance of animals that you can consume, is there a need to eat fermented meat beyond if it's like a delicacy and you're eating it for flavor or some other reason?
Yeah, I think probably not. Especially if you are healthy, maybe if you've got some kind of gut imbalance, fermented meat might be really helpful for restoring that. But based on the anecdotes that I know of, I know lots of people who are doing really, really well, who not only eat no liver and no salt, but they don't eat high meat either.
Yeah, exactly. High meat, exactly.
James, did you have something you were going to say, James?
I do, but if you've got questions to continue. This is not to do with salt, basically. Or
I just wanted to go back just on the topic. It's related to salt with hydration. I know we got a little bit of time still. It is just you were kind of talking about like lower extracellular fluid and maybe possibly needing, or I think you mentioned like being able to be normal at lower extracellular fluids. I just was researching the other day that glycogen increases intracellular fluid. Do you see like any benefit or risk of having, more extracellular fluid or more intracellular fluid, or is it more of a balance game? Because anecdotally, like when I have a lot of salty things in my extracellular fluid, I drink a lot of liquid, I feel like very lethargic. But if I have like a lot of starches and carbs free of salt, you maybe feel a little bit bigger, but like I don't feel as lethargic.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, if you're on a low carb diet, the water and salt will make you lethargic. But if you're on a starchy diet, the water and salt is more tolerable. Is that what you're saying?
I think of it more like a cheat meal. So this is one of the questions I actually had was like, what would be more detrimental as a cheat meal? So like if you took somebody that's on, a very strict carnivore diet, they're not consuming salt, they're not consuming plants, they're metabolically healthy. And then, they go home for Thanksgiving. We'll say that because, Thanksgiving's coming up, right? Would it be more of a detriment to them to have well, I guess if you're having carbs in both instances, it is a detriment, but like to have a meal that's like really high in salt as someone that doesn't use salt, or to have unsalted starchy vegetable, like which one of those would be worse?
I love this kind of question of, what are the worst kinds of physical consequence transgressions you could have from a carnivore diet? Because there's so many different ideas about it, and in some ways it's personal. I know definitely a lot of carnivores have the experience, even if they're a low salt carnivore, of going, say, to a Brazilian restaurant where the meat is highly salted, and you're not going to ask them not to salt it. And I've done that numerous times. When I go to restaurants, I usually eat a lot more salt than I normally would. And I think I I think it's okay. It's hard to detangle the effects from going to a Brazilian restaurant and eating like huge amounts of protein, huge amounts of food, and huge amounts of salt, and then how you feel the next day. What was the biggest factor? I'm not really sure, but
For
I can
sure.
tell you that you know it it's never been. I've never woken up and thought, "Oh my God, I'm never doing that again."
Right.
Um,
Have you experimented with like have you gone back and tried certain carbohydrate? Have you tried carbs with like no salt? Out of
yeah,
curiosity.
I have tried. I have done a lot of experiments with potatoes starting a couple years ago. And I found that potatoes in particular for me and rice in particular for me are not problematic. They don't cause mood crashes. They're probably not very good for, weight. I don't know if you or your listeners know this about me, but just a really brief rundown. In 2018, I had a terrible, a series of gut infections, a terrible, terrible salmonella infection, which took me years to recover from. I had post-infectious IBS, and during that period, I gained back almost as much weight as I lost in the first place on a carnivore diet, all the while eating a carnivore diet. So it was a big education for me.
Yeah.
And I'm still in the process of resolving the health consequences from that one fateful infection.
Salmonella and a carnivore diet. I'm sure you got a lot of shit for that one.
Yeah.
It was horrible.
The vegans will come after you.
Yeah. And it was actually introducing starch that for whatever reason really it broke the cycle of the bad digestion for me. And it really happened like with one meal. It wasn't like I introduced potatoes and then after a couple of weeks, my digestion got better. It was like I ate the potatoes, immediately had a huge correction that caused me to do a bunch more experimentation. And I didn't really get much more benefit from continuing to eat them or not. So I stopped eating them eventually. But
Yeah.
the question was whether starch seemed to be bad for me. And I think
Free of salt.
free of salt, the potatoes that I ate in that one initiating thing were from a restaurant. And so I'm sure they were salted. And I think that with carbohydrates, your salt, it actually requires more salt. And there's this like synergy between sugar and salt for the gut, which is why Gatorade has both sugar and salt. All these like infusions that try to help you get your electrolytes usually come with sugar because there's this synergy between the sugar and salt. I have not, well, that's not true because I have tried eating only rice for a few days at a time.
Bodybuilder diet.
Yeah, and this I didn't add any salt to my rice because why would you? Um, uh, and um, and it was fine for me at that time. That's all I can tell you.
So wait a minute. Why do you feel like it's necessary for carbs? Because didn't in the blood, sweat, and tears presentation, I think you mentioned like it was I'm gonna botch this. I think it was like Yamamoto or some sort of South American tribe was on like as low as 40 milligrams of sodium
Yeah,
per day. So they
no,
probably
that's
weren't eating
absolutely
meat, right?
true. That's absolutely true. They would have had some animal source food in their diet because there's no people that don't. But I don't know what it was in particular in that case.
I gotcha. And
But
just one more question too, just on the topic of carbs, and then James, you ask your question. So you experimented with potatoes, and not asking this as an endorsement of carbs or anything, but do you kind of see it as like a carb is a carb, or is it nuanced within different carbohydrates, would you say?
no, I don't think that just because I think the carnivore diet is an amazing diet and has a lot of therapeutic potential and may even be the best possible diet for humans, I don't think that carbs are evil or that people can't be really healthy on high carb diets or that even some people might feel better on high carb diets than on a carnivore diet. So I just want to make sure that's clear. But I do think that just like there are different effects of different fatty acids and different amino acid profiles, different carbohydrates, even to maybe a further extent, have different health effects. So some people, there are all these diet wars going on all the time, but some people are really pro-starch, and they think that a diet based on starch with very little else is actually the best possible human diet. And some people, like the repeat people, I believe, are against starch, and they think that a diet of saturated fat and fruit and dairy is the ultimate human diet. And
It's a Rubik's Cube.
yeah, I think, all of these ideas come from somewhere and have some basis in either observation or theory or both. And I don't know what contexts make each one more or less dangerous. But like some people are absolutely against fructose and think it's the worst possible sugar you can have. But it may be the case that fructose is only really detrimental in the backdrop of a grain-based diet. Whereas if your diet is mostly meat and dairy, and then you add fructose on top of that, it might not be dangerous at all. And it's really hard to tease apart all these factors.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
still
What do you
so
think about
many
Paul Saladino?
areas. Yeah, that's the question. Yeah, go ahead.
You don't
Well,
have to
so what
answer.
Paul Saladino has been advocating for, okay, so I think Paul Saladino is really smart. And when he came onto the scene in Carnivore, he grasped all the fundamental ideas really quickly, wrote a book about it. It was
Very
really
quickly.
astounding. And then was finding that there's like many possible explanations for why he changed to a repeat type of diet, which is what he's doing. It's not new to him, right? One reason could be that we have a very cynical explanation that there's just a much bigger opportunity in that diet space. But you could also see that he was eating high amounts of vitamin A, which I don't know anyone who succeeds on the carnivore diet eating that much liver, except possibly the paleo medicina people who do eat organ meats. But what I always say about that is that they're eating a variety of organ meats, so the amount of liver, it's not like all the organ meats come from liver. Also, they're eating a much lower calorie volume and protein amount than a standard carnivore diet. And so there might be something about this ketogenic therapeutic situation that allows them to tolerate more. But basically anybody else who came into the space and said, yes, eat a carnivore diet, but you've got to get those organs in, within a couple of years, they were out saying, this diet doesn't work. It sucks. I had to add back in carbs because I didn't feel good. And that's my number one suspicion about what would have happened to Paul Saladino to make him not feel good on a carnivore diet. But the other thing that I do know about him is that it's unclear to what degree he was actually compliant the whole time, how much fat he was getting. There are a whole lot of other factors that are really cloudy because he came in and out so fast, and it's hard to know what was going on with him exactly. And I do think that the repeat style diet works really well for a lot of people. I think
it's worked well for me without a colon, low key, but I don't do it. Not currently.
For sure. Yeah, I think that there are situations that might be more I can't think of the word that I want, but better for one or the other. And certainly if you want to get the brain benefits of ketosis, and that could be because of mood or because of, cognitive decline or because of epilepsy, or because of cancer, any of those situations, I think that a ketogenic style diet would be a superior, more obvious choice. But I certainly don't think that the repeat diet is a bad choice.
Yeah. Good point. Excellent point about the liver stuff and the organ stuff. And I think it's something which is not pointed out clearly enough, often enough, in my opinion. But I agree with you.
I was just gonna say, another. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, I want to talk about the satiation thing as well, but I think we're short on time. That's all I was gonna say. So James, just go ahead.
Yeah. So, are you okay for the next 10 minutes, Amber? Or was it? Or did you want to
10
wrap up?
tops.
10 tops. Okay. So this is just sort of things that have been happening over the last couple of weeks. But I've been reading Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and unfortunately, it's not a surprise. Most of the things I've been reading in there, but with Robert Kennedy Jr. sort of helping out around health, hopefully this is something where we can look out to the future in a positive light. And I think that's where the podcasts come into it, because like people like yourself have been out there speaking about this stuff for years, and hopefully this is a bit of a green light to more funding for research and science around low carb diets, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, one can hope. There are a lot of people who I think would benefit from hearing a different point of view from the official view we've been getting about health. But I also think that a lot of those people have already closed their minds to anything that RFK might have to say. He gets a lot of media flack. So whether that turns out to be something that can turn the tides or not, I don't know.
I'm feeling hopeful.
Good. That's a good way to feel.
James, did you have any other questions with that?
No, that was about it. So yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. Maybe if you're open to it, we could have another conversation, like strictly on what you're doing with satiation and all that fun stuff, because I don't know if you'd be able to tackle all that in 6-7 minutes. So it's been a very good conversation so far today. So really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Well, maybe let me leave just one little teaser. I would love to come back and talk about it, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what it means to be against the calories in, calories out model. And a lot of people get really upset because they think that what we're saying is that some kind of magic is happening where it doesn't matter, like food can just disappear or something like that. And that's really not what it is about at all. But what you eat can make a big difference in both how well you lose weight and the composition of the weight that you're losing. And the satiation piece is really central to that. And I would love to talk about it more on another time.
Sweet. Yeah, really
that would be
appreciate it.
fantastic.
I wanted to get into the salt thing a little bit, and we can always get into that more too. That's a big book as well. So yeah, a lot to talk about. And if you ever want to work with us too on like, these are topics to discuss too, like just send them my way. You did it with a couple, so really appreciated that. But yeah, thanks for taking some time out of your day to do this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Amber.
Thanks a lot, Amber. Hope to see you soon.